You should recognize the teal table at the bottom left of your screen from our last video on c-betting. To review, the first line says that when you're facing one opponent and you c-bet, the chances that that opponent missed the flop, meaning he didn't connect with it at all, are 65%, about 2/3 of the time. So that the corresponding size of your continuation bet, for which you'll break even in the long run, is 2 times the pot. In our last video, we recommended only betting between half and 100% of the pot, so as to conceal your c-bet, make it look more like your value bets so that your opponents don't get suspicious. We left out 3 more advanced concepts that relate to the c-bet though, which we'll discuss in this video. The first was that when your opponent misses, we assumed this meant he folded, every time. We basically said there was a 100% correlation between your opponent missing the flop and his fold rate. Secondly, we ignored something called position. Check out our position video if that sounds foreign to you. And lastly, we ignored something called flop texture. We'll do another video entirely on this topic in the future, but we'll just reference how it relates directly to c-betting here. So we'll go through each of these topics one at a time and explain how it can affect the attractiveness of c-betting. First, we'll talk about our assumption that a miss meant a fold. Let's rework that break-even point of 2 times the pot. Let's say the pot is 200, and we make a 2-pot c-bet. Sometimes it'll work, we'll win the pot, and sometimes it won't. We lose that c-bet. So when we win, we're plus 200 chips. When we lose, minus 400. 2 times the 200 pot. The question you should ask yourself is, how many times do we have to win the pot to offset the time that we lose our c-bet? It's 2 times. 2 times 200, 400, equally offsets the minus 400 when we lose the c-bet. Our opponent either raises us on the flop or calls our bet and then pushes us out of the pot on the turn. We lose the 400. And this 2-to-1 ratio of winning and losing means that 2 out of every 3 hands have to be successful when we c-bet for us to break even in the long run. And that happens to be the percent of times that our opponent will miss when we're facing one and only one opponent. And that's why, if you assume he folds every time he misses, 2 times the pot's a break-even c-bet size. But in reality, a certain percent of the time that our opponent misses, he's actually going to call our bet or maybe even raise us, especially in this day and age, as your opponents are getting wiser, and he might even know what a c-bet is, and he might try and defend against it, even if he misses. The way you react to this is you should shrink the size of your c-bets as close as possible to our minimum recommended c-betting size of 1/2 the pot. Let's go through the same profit tree, this time with a 1/2 pot c-bet, and see what that does to the rate, the break-even threshold for profitability, and what that means in terms of how often we would be expecting our opponent to continue when he misses the flop. Again, we'll win some of these and we'll lose some. When we win, we're still just winning the 200 chip pot. When we lose, though, we save a bunch of money. We're only winning half the pot. This time, every time we win the pot, we can actually afford to lose our c-bet twice. And that's fantastic news. The 200 profit offsets the 200 in loss. And instead of a 2-to-1 ratio, win to losses, we have a 1-to-2 ratio, the reverse. And this translates into 1 out of every 3 c-bets must work for us to break even. Against a 2/3 miss rate by our opponent, that means we can afford to have our opponent call or raise up to half the time that he misses. That's a pretty high number of him, or a high number of hands that he continues even when he misses. So you can use the 1/2 pot c-bet as a baseline, and as you think you're against more novice or tighter opponents, you can start increasing that closer to 2/3 and maybe occasionally even the size of the pot. Okay, the second advanced issue that we didn't discuss in video 1 was that of position. We were actually out of position in the example in our last video. That means we acted first, both on the flop and pre-flop. We didn't know if our opponent had missed. We were just playing the numbers, guessing that 2/3 out of the time he's missed. So based on the math in the profit trees above, we determined it was profitable to bet into him. But there was a vulnerability there of if he calls us or if he raises us. There's ways to defend against this when you're out of position. Advanced topics like the check raise, a delayed c-bet where you check the flop and then bet the turn, or something called a float where you check call his bet, planning to bluff on a later street. But in this intermediate level video, we'll just recommend that you c-bet less often out of position because you're vulnerable to a call or a raise from your opponent. On the other hand, if you're in position, c-bet more often. Why? Because you get to see if your opponent checks. If he checks to you, this is a really reliable indicator that he missed the flop. So your c-bets are going to work a much higher percent of the time. And you can even be more aggressive and increase the size of your c-bets because they're going to work more often, and your profit tree will balance out even with a larger size c-bet. And lastly, let's talk flop texture. Flop texture is the likelihood that the flop connected with one or more of your opponents. A flop like 10 of clubs, 9 of clubs, queen of hearts, we would call that a wet flop. Meaning because of the flop texture, there's a really high chance that one of your opponents either has that club flush draw or a straight draw. When the flop is wet, meaning the flop texture is bad, avoid c-betting, specifically naked c-betting, meaning c-betting when you've missed the flop as well. If you have either the flush or a straight draw or even top pair top kicker, bet to protect your hand, but don't naked c-bet.